He is very soon defending his dissertation, which is also what he's going to be talking about today, in border rhetoric, or Latino rhetorics and writing studies. He's done a lot of interesting things since he's left us. He's been working full-time as a tenured faculty member at a Northwest Vista Community College. So he was actually just promoted to associate professor at that institution. And I'm going to let him explain everything else he does because it's way smarter than anything that I know how to do. But anyway, thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
I like to first, it takes a little bit of time. I'm not trying to fill up time because I have a lot to say, but just to thank everyone here. And I feel very humbled being in front of you in the position I am right now because I came from here. So I just want to thank you guys. Now, the work I'm going to introduce is work that I would do sort of like in an upper division writing course. It comes out of what I learned from studying in upper division writing courses. Get in?
It was a worker.
Oh, okay. All right. Cuerpo. Here she comes. Cuerpo. Respiré profundamente y nací. Sí, nací aquí adentro de los intersticios. Soy un cuerpo situado entre las fronteras, sobre el pecho de mi madre Gloria. De entre las manos de mi padre, soy un cuerpo situado dentro de los márgenes. Ten cuidado, cuerpo mío, cuidado. My research deals with the spatialization of bodies, a process not only of causing something to occupy space, but also of placing that something into a specific context. I spatialize bodies, including but not limited to literacy and literacy practices, so I can identify the role of place with and in bodies. I will introduce a concept called cuerpo, meaning body in Spanish, which brings together lived experiences and a theoretical framework. I use my concept to argue that literacy takes place, occurs within a place, and that literacy practices are interactive rhetorical actions from and with a literate body, which I later define as spaces of representation informed in part by social practices and power relations of that place. Cuerpo approaches literacy and literacy practices as complex spatial systems within a social cultural context, taking into account cultural clashes that may exist, especially within the context like the borderlands. Coming from the borderlands, I first establish why I engage in the spatialization of bodies. First, the experience most Latino bodies have within writing classrooms concerns me. Usually, these bodies experience suppression from conventional hegemonic social practices prevalent across writing classrooms, especially within the borderland region. Robert Yagalski suggests these practices align with a Cartesian view of writing and points to the effects such practices have on participants. When we teach writing in fundamental conventional ways, we are teaching fundamental lessons about the self and its relation to the world around us that in turn lead to problematic ways of being in the world. Such lessons may have a significant impact on bodies inhabiting the U.S.-Mexico borderland, considering the historical relationship that exists between Western European descendants and Latinos, beginning with the Treaty of Guadalupe in 1848. Writing instruction set on conventional hegemonic social practices make the body irrelevant toward the words the body produces. Laura Rendon, who grew up in Laredo, reflects about such an experience where her body is irrelevant. She describes instruction meant to suppress her identity, her social cultural background, and any subjective interpretation. She also describes pedagogies aimed to alienate her. Second, based on flesh and blood experiences, theorizing about writing instruction and pedagogy in the borderlands requires an alternate perspective, an approach that includes otherness, as well as lived spaces. Beliefs about pedagogy and difference will directly affect the work that takes place within classrooms. Dora Ramirez Dorr and Rebecca Jones urge practitioners to look beyond the surface of what constitutes difference and to examine further the social practices that take place within social, cultural, political, and educational contexts. You see, most practitioners, including myself, have adopted notions that suggest literacy as literacy practices are situated, but a student's ethnicity within the classroom often goes unnoticed, especially when literacies are positioned in relation to the social institutions and power relations which sustain them. When literacies are positioned in relation to hegemonic social institutions, it's clear to see how practitioners may disregard their notions about how bodies exist within a place and amongst the social practices of that place. Third, practitioners who seek to localize bodies in relation to place could find support in Chicana rhetoric, specifically Chicana rhetoric associated with Chicana third space feminism, especially the idea of a theory in the flesh. You see, the flesh contributes to theoretically infused writing that inscribe a different register according to Norma Alarcón. The register of bodies or women of color for Chicanas. When I write flesh, it feels like I'm carving bone. It feels like I'm creating my own face, my own heart, says Gloria Zaldúa, alma querida. To support such bodily inclusivity, my research draws from Chicana rhetoric because Chicanas use an embodied voice that includes the body as a site of critical reflection and understanding of one's life world. And with that, I present Cuerpo. This theoretical framework excavates the spatialization of bodies. It ruptures surfaces to expose gaps in literacy practices, revealing what Gloria Zaldúa refers to as napakna, the space in between space, the site of transformation. To explain, literacy models or approaches to literacy often fail to take into consideration bodies and their complexity within a social cultural context. Lived experiences in connection to literacy and literacy practices demonstrate how the autonomous model or the functional approach to literacy inadequately serves some participants, and how the functional approach will discriminatively single out marginalized bodies. For a more inclusive approach, I mean to extend the field of new literacy studies by addressing literacy practices in relation to how bodies exist within a place, especially for a place like the U.S.-Mexico borderland, where cultures and race collide. But why? Well, because if embedded social practices only determine the meaning of literacy and the effect of literacy practices, then an ideological model to literacy and literacy practices may be ineffectual for practitioners. Under this approach, practitioners would only perpetuate the marginalization of bodies that are devalued under such social practices within such a place. Bodies matter, and place to bodies matters more. My body is a bordered body, a site where location, materiality, and rhetoric join to render my body as a visibly marked body, and it's from the body that I draw my theoretical framework. My cuerpo and its effect on literacy and literacy practices are contingent to a distinctive place identity, and I tie that to meaningful and lived aspects of identity to place. I urge practitioners to identify place, especially as they explore the symbolic actions by marginalized writers. These actions, I gather, are interactive rhetorical actions manifesting as a result of that place. Location, materiality, and rhetoric juncturings contextualize literacy and literacy practices concepts in relation to how bodies exist within a place. These terms are interdependent, largely based on Christy Fleckenstein's work dealing with embodied literacies, where literacies evolve and are enacted within porous sites, such as bodies, cultures, times, and places. Now, Location identifies how bodies are located in place, where place is not a thing, but a process continually making and remaking its own boundaries, penetrating the system, constituting the entire system. The proximity and tangibility of a location plus being suggests that a body in one place is not the same body in another place. Location highlights the process to place the body among other language users within the physical sites they occupy. In other words, discursive practices are located in space and actively produce space. Materiality. Materiality refers to the social milieu, a social and physical context, and refers to how that social milieu connects to literacy practice manifestations, or what Christy Fleckenstein calls the materialization of literacy, within bodies, within cultures, places, and times. Thus, materiality defines the embodiment of a material place, where context becomes an ongoing process and practice deeply tied up with the word, in my case, with rhetoric. Materiality signifies a contextualized specificity dealing not only with the manifestation of bodies, but also the spatialization of bodies into those distinctive place identities. Again, meaningful lived aspects of identity linked to place. Rhetoric. Rhetoric underscores how literacy practices then are interactive rhetorical actions from and with a place. Fleckenstein writes, sign and design, architecture and rhetoric are inextricable. She endorses how our language, our social political rhetorics is shaped by design of public spaces as well as places. This notion links rhetoric with place and rhetorical actions from a place. But rhetoric suggests more than symbolic actions known as signifying practices, the practice that produces meaning, that make things mean. Rhetoric also suggests a theory of representation in language, which Stuart Hall refers to as a constructivist approach. When Hall claims that meaning depends on the symbolic functions of signs and context, he suggests that the process is contingent then on the interactions situated within a subject's relationship to their material world, back again to the materiality, and their place within that world, back again to rhetoric. Cuerpo is my framework for spatializing bodies. I consider the act of writing interactive, one that depends on a complex matrix of activity systems within various ecologies. Writing consists of a complex web of ideas, purposes, interpersonal interactions, cultural norms, textual forms, writes Fleckenstein. I found a way to make some sense out of writing, or the processes of writing, by looking at writing in and of itself as constituting a form that represents a spatial body. Cuerpo is my version of an ecological metaphor, which Fleckenstein identifies as a way of knowing that is congruent with the complexity and messiness of not only 21st century meaning making, but also meaning making amid borders. I organize Cuerpo into junctures that intersect as part of a larger dialectic triad, where dialectical contradictions are assigned specific localities. So these are the localities that I've assigned. Cuerpo emerges from that process of juncturing, a term I harvest from Gloria Zaldúa and Chela Sandoval in Chicana rhetoric. From that point, I manifest Cuerpo's instantiated embodiment with a process called transdisciplinary positioning, where concepts from rhetoric and composition and Chicana third space feminism occupy positions related to theories associated with the sociality of space, or the sociology of space. Cuerpo, acting like a bordered corporeality cachet, captures transdisciplinary positioning in connection with the localities known as spatial practices, spaces of representation, and representations of space. I appropriate the terms from Soja's trialectics of space, but differently, because these localities embody a particular place or situation in time and space. Now, Barbara Nescu claims transdisciplinary concerns that which is at once in between the disciplines, across the disciplines, and beyond non-discipline. Its goal is the understanding of the present world, of which one of the imperatives is the unity of knowledge. And that's what I've done here by bringing in all these disciplines, is trying to understand then how we spatialize bodies by looking beyond what the disciplines have offered. My three-dimensional approach here attempts to understand the production of not only corporeal bodies, but of discursive bodies in relation to specified place. The pathways. Under these locations or localities, there are certain pathways. Relative to space, the body does not exist apart from space, and a body, although positioned, will constitute its historicality, sociality, and spatiality from its interconnected interactions to generate a place within a space. But bodies, like Jennifer Bay points out, are always in motion, moving, shifting as a matrix of information process. As a result, I must consider how such movements transform bodies. So these are the pathways that will lead to the transformation as you produce bodies. The first one. So if I'm looking here at materiality and location under Cuerpo, that's one locality of spatial practices, and the body, the pathway, is the corporeal. The materiality location dialectic establishes a pathway for corporeal, which points toward the contradictions of everyday life for bodies. For rhetorical actions, these contradictions mark the effect of literacy practices in time and space. I'm going to point to this screen so y'all can follow how I'm reading this stuff here. For rhetorical actions, these contradictions mark the effects of literacy practices in time and space. This historicality, continuity over time, then plays a part in assembling the sociality of not only space, but also of bodies in place. For the affirmation of bodies results from their spatial practices. The location rhetoric dialectic establishes a pathway for what I call bordered eye subjectivity for bodies, which points to discourses on the body. Bordered eye subjectivity refers to the situated complex nature of bodies and their negations in between identity and subjectivity. To the situated complex, For rhetorical actions, this complexity and negation connects to situated literacy and the situated nature of subjects. The situatedness contextualizes and locates bodies as places within sociality, where sociality of bodies comes into negation with the representations of space. The rhetoric materiality dialectic establishes a pathway in what I call a literate body, which points to the discourses of the body. This literate body is informed in part from the social practices and power relations of a given place. For rhetorical actions, informed bodies manifest the meaning of literacy, which the effect goes on to impact literacy practices. Once again, the view is realized how bodies designate place, where the spatiality of bodies is other than by the space of representation that are embodied. So if you look what I've done here with the spatialization of body, here is Cuerpo for me. This is what I developed, which is the dialectic triad. Now under that triad, I established these localities based on transdisciplinary positionings. Now how I tie that to the rhetorical actions is what I just explained here, is that the effect of literacy and practices in time and space results as a result of that dialectic between materiality and location. And we can connect that to spatial practices. What I've done under Chicana feminism is I've kind of identified their spatial body as writing. Their spatial body is a bordered corporeality, because under the effect of literacy and practices in time and space, Chicana feminism discursively engaged spatiality by intermingling the corporeality and materiality of their lived experience. Under the rhetorical action of situated literacy and the situated nature of subject position, Chicana feminists, their instantiated embodiments from the spatialization of bodies is corporeal and rhetorical, because their texts are very much a part of their own lives as well as discursive. And then under the meaning of literacy, what Chicana feminism has done here is the creation of a discursive space through a rhetoric of difference. And altogether for them, their spatialized body is a bordered corporeality. The rhetorical outcomes, or the rhetorical goods I get from this theory, is where it leads to the transformation then. If I take the materiality and location dialectic, which fosters the pathway of the corporeal, and I intersect then the third term, which Soja always talks about getting to third space as a third term, then we're looking here at rhetorical practices as a result of those spatial practices. If I take that dialectic and intersect it then with materiality, when it comes to those representations of space, I'm looking then at rhetorical agency when it comes to writing studies. If I move this dialectic also, that's the literate body, which is really a space of representation once we've learned what literacy is, and I intersect that with location, what we're talking then is about a rhetorical situation. Now this is first, second, and third space, but in spatial theory, I go back to Henry Lefebvre, who really does a good job of contextualizing the production of space with bodies. Soja did not do that because he doesn't account for alterity and difference. So Lefebvre talks about having a fourth term, a transcendent term, and that is my cuerpo here, which is l'espace. Because then we can talk about in rhetorical studies about rhetorical sovereignty. And not only recognizing difference, but acknowledging that difference in writing. Now, because I spatialized what Moraga and Azadua originated in for a theory in the flesh into a practical framework, Cuerpo will set forth Teoría Encarnada, an embodied theory demonstrating not only how bodies manifest, but also the co-constructive and co-evolutionary nature of literate bodies in relation to their places. A Teoría Encarnada is made from a framework that involves multiple intersections and undergoes constant change simultaneously. The notion of distinctive place identities will enhance rhetorical theory under the notion that literate bodies engage in the production, distribution, and consumption of rhetorical bodies. Bodies that constitute cultural compositions from and with a particular set of practices, either social or discursive. This perception will lead to a further contextualization of culture as a process or processes, and will provide an opportunity then for the spatialization of cultures. The spatialization of cultures, much like that for bodies, will hopefully destabilize assumptions about the term culture as an essentialist concept of social or ethnic groups. In this way, I expect Cuerpo to transcend disciplinary boundaries and to cross over into multiple disciplinaries or boundaries. Cuerpo will also add discussion to border theory, especially for how bodies not only manifest, but interconnect in relation to other places. In this fashion, Cuerpo will add discussion to Chicana rhetorics, especially for establishing a third space masculine practice, which is right now outside of that discipline. Mm-hmm. And finally, like its inception, Cuerpo will encourage, invite, and cultivate an attitude of transdisciplinarity, which synthesizes multiple disciplines for creating places among the disciplines to offer a new perspective, new knowledge, and new epistemology. Through transdisciplinarity, practitioners can then take their part within the gifts of engagement, those gifts of production as meaning makers rather than consumers, and more importantly, those gifts of transformation that we are all trying to do with our students. My papers are pretty. I like to move around.
Okay,
because I'm always a body in motion.
I'll tell Dr. Carlin asked. It's fun. Go ahead. No, this is really interesting because one of the problems with border theory in the 90s is that it sort of challenges these binaries that exist within cultures, but it winds up creating a different set of binaries, essentially saying our binaries are better than your binaries, or something like that. But I really like the way you've situated this, and that using the third space and the idea of moving beyond these sort of simple representations and placing the body in the middle. I also noticed that you use all the biggies in genre theory for your conclusions.
Yeah.
And did you ever? And it's a genuine question, not a right answer. Did you ever take that step forward into genre theory and think about what cuerpo means specifically to genre?
When we talk about manifesting, if I'm looking at writing as constituting a distinctive place identity, then we're setting it as genre.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at how those genres then typify that place identity.
Yeah, way of being in the world. Yeah. Cool.
And with border theory, the third space, what's lacking in border theory with third space is that third space is not organic and reflexive. And this is trying to make third space more organic and reflexive to contextualize itself like it says it's supposed to. So.
Cool. Very good. Cool.
Yes.
I actually have about 3 questions, but to monopolize this. One short one. You keep referencing somebody named Stein. What's that?
Christy Fleckenstein, she's in rhetoric and composition, and she studies a lot at looking at language as an embodied literacy. She also looks at the architecture dealing with visual rhetoric. She has this wonderful book on vision, rhetoric as a social action, where she studies what are the social movements that advance social action, and those are the social movements that really incorporate the body within what they're trying to distribute as part of their message. So it's really interesting.
And then my other question is, I noticed that your first slide is dated 2012.
Yeah.
And you obviously put a lot of time in developing this theory.
Yes.
And so I guess my question is, why haven't you, I know you're writing your dissertation, that takes and working, why haven't you published this? I mean, you've had a good grip on this now for a number of years, it looks like.
Well, 2 reasons. One, I've done a lot of conferences with presenting this information, and at every conference it seems to grow. And it seems to refine itself. Because when I came up with this rhetorical theory, I had the outcome, but I didn't know how to get there. And I had to go back and trace backwards. The second reason, I guess, would be my chair, who's holding on to this stuff, and she sees the value of it. She wants some of it to go out, but then she doesn't want it to go out yet. So, yeah. But it's been out there through conferences. And it's been refining, because my first terms, I think it was materiality, location, place, and I had language rather than rhetoric. But then I learned those terms weren't really working with how I was theorizing the stuff.
This is related to what Nancy just asked you too, because that's a good question. Is in terms of publishing in a broader sense, how has your working on this theory and developing this theory, how has that affected your teaching practices and the program you built?
It's all been interconnected, because the program I built deals with accelerated learning. And one of the things they asked me to design is, how do you teach a class that has half college ready and half developmental students? How would you approach that? And I went back with this theory. I said, well, you have to really contextualize the curriculum in there. And you have to start within their body. And I tied it back to, the popular thing in border theory is Gloria Zaldúa, ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. Mm-hmm. That's great. But someone's come around and studying academic discourse and said, well, we don't live identities within discourse, we live identity within bodies. So I really had to think of developing curriculum that looks at the student as a way of them understanding who they are first, so then they can understand how they use language. And part of that is a little odd for students because they're like, why am I talking about this? And they're like, well, we're getting there. We're getting there. Don't worry. And then at the very end, they make all the connections. And part of that is like when they're looking at studying languages in their own space, we use music. Students are drawn to music. Well, I asked them to bring the song that they're really into at the moment, a lyrical song, not a song that repeats the same lyric over and over. Because then we don't have much to work with. Well, what we learn is that the student who has, say, like a Patsy Cline song that's more standard versus somebody with a Tupac song, and it's like, look at these two discursively, through discourse analysis. That student tends to write in phrases because that's what they're popular in within that socio-cultural context, where the other student is more attuned to writing not just in phrases. And they study that and they learn it for themselves, and then they don't like the music after that. So, yes.
So I kind of a two-part question, and it's kind of blossomed out of the Rendon quote that was early on in your presentation. Her quotation about, nobody asked me about mi familia, mi barrio, my life experiences. And you were talking about her body being irrelevant, right? That's what that quotation is supposed to be talking about. But to me, family, barrio, life experiences, those things aren't the body. Those are things in which the body is present, right? So the first part of this question is, how do you define the body, and why is it capable in your theory of being so? How does it occupy? How do you define the body?
Part one.
Part one. And the second part of the question is that this idea of cuerpo, which I find totally fascinating, but I am curious about the relationship between high theory and inventing theoretical terms, and how they might also take us away from the body that you privilege so much, that you're just talking about in this example. I'm curious how you get those.
Well, let me go with this. Why I use the word cuerpo. Cuerpo in Spanish is going to contextualize my work because I am Hispanic. I would say Hispanic. And I try to connect that with my work. Now, how the body, these are the advancements that rhetorical theory is leading us to when you're looking at upper division writing, is there's more things on the outside that make up who we are. It's not just that we're a body in place. We have agency within our own environment, and that's looking at eco-composition, which looks at how the environment impacts not only language, but the power relations and where language is used, distributed, consumed. It's looking more at the environment as all constituting the system, which leads into network theory of how things manifest. So, did I answer your question? I don't know.
I'm still not clear on why you couldn't use the word network then instead of body.
Well,
Why
I do
is
use
network?
network, but our bodies are like a network. They respond and to different situations, scenarios like a network. We emerge also, and there's a lot of work that deals with rhetoric as emerging now, agency as emergent, where different things impact agency, not just within like the subject. So there's some things, when I talk about bordered I-subjectivity, that's coming out of Helen Foster's network process, which is coming out of process theory and looking at the different ways that our subjectivity is split within a network of ideas and a network and environment. So I just don't like network, sounds so technical. So.
I'm with Kelly here, but I'm thinking through this a little bit. Nowhere near able to think through it like Kelly does. It seems like Clifford Geertz in one of his works has a phrase that says humans are suspended in webs of culture.
Yeah.
And that seems,
Yeah.
No, you didn't take it.
Oh.
that seems to me to be, I mean, when you think of network theory, and why don't you use network, it seems that when you talk about network and networking, you see the word that we would use would be nodes, right?
Which we are
to say a
node.
node in a network is different from saying a body. in a network, I don't know.
And you know, I guess, I mean, the body's being split so many times, right? Starting with looking at consciousness. I wasn't drawn to, for me, it was just natural to see our body as being a network of processes. And I didn't want to go with the language networking. Yes.
I guess I was wondering, I guess I was assuming that there was some kind of reminder there of concrete experience. Like, I guess I'm wondering if what Kelly's asking is, at what point does your theory just say, hello, we're real people living in space, and then
Well-
beyond that, there's all this other symbolic stuff that's happening. We can't deny the first, I mean, isn't that the materiality piece?
Yeah, you know, when I said at the beginning that this theory develops from lived experiences, it's not just a lived experience I got from Chicano writers. In my dissertation, it's really changing the styles of the dissertation because there's poetry in the dissertation that's kind of creative. There's also personal experience or personal narrative, which goes back to Dr. Kirk Leiter's use of narrative. And then there's all this rhetorical theory stuff along with spatial theories. And I talk a lot about my personal experience, and the biggest impact I had in education growing up was attending A&M Kingsville versus A&M Corpus Christi and noticing how these are two iconic, I'm going to say iconic, okay? I don't want it, I'm just going to say iconic, but two institutions so closely in proximity with each other, they have distinctive, very distinctive identities, and the student experience there is a sharp contrast. And I didn't understand that. And I'm very grateful for this institution.
Yeah.
So, one thing that I was curious about surrounding the body was the way in which the body's rhetoric is multi-semiotic, right? The body doesn't just write on paper or speak.
Yeah.
It's word, it's gesture. I'm looking at your image there. They're writing on bodies. Bodies signify in all kinds of ways. So how do nonverbal rhetorics come up in your theory?
Well, they're part of reading it as a rhetorical piece. Like if you look at this piece, this is an artwork from Vincent Valdez. He's an artist there in San Antonio, local artist. And he encountered postcards of lynchings in Texas that people would send to each other in a store. And he understand that. And then he noticed that some of those were brown bodies. But the dominant imaginary of lynching is the black body. We don't have an imaginary of a brown body. So he was interested with that, and then I led him to a piece that dealt with how in the United States there have been more brown bodies lynched of Mexican descent or Latinos or Hispanics in the U.S. than there have been brown bodies. But we do not have that imaginary because those images aren't circulated. So this is what he's trying to do. And he's manifesting this history through art as something that you can read. And what he's doing is he doesn't include the noose or the straps. Why? Because that history is not seen. And the social practices in the U.S. when it comes to Latinos is so embedded within the power relations that it goes unnoticed. And that's why he didn't include those nooses.
I just want to applaud you. You know, when you said that you go to conference to find your work,
Yeah.
to collaborate with others, that's what a true scholar is. And you take your time because when this gets published, it will be recognized. It is unique. I haven't seen anything like it. And when it gets published, it will be a work that involves lots of collaboration, which I think embodies our culture.
Yeah, and it goes part of that networking idea of how you manifest literacy. I mean, that's what I've done here, this idea is manifesting that literacy. Yeah.
We need to move to, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we're, yeah, something I'd like to try to announce, yeah. Yeah, we need to get to your syllabus. This is a great conversation, I'm not trying to get anything off, but
Oh, it's over here. do I want me to go over the syllabus? Am I supposed? I just go over it? Okay, I'll just go over it. Okay.
How about taking a clue from you, at least in my case,
Uh,
what do students do in your class at this stage? And how's that feel balanced?
Okay. Well, the syllabus I have here is interesting because I took a week to put it together. Normally, I take a whole semester to put it together. Now, just to talk a little bit about the process I do when putting a course together, I like to think of a course into 3 areas. So how can I divide my course into 3 areas that will progress students? So I came up with the course you have here, 5369, Topics and Genres and Rhetoric Composition. I went from post-process to post-composition. Now the description I have talks about the latter part of the 20th century, taking that linguistic turn, one in which language is a dominant tool in the toolbox. I'm exploring first the content to look at language and bodies, so I'm connecting it back to the work I've done dealing with bodies in a global age. And I'm taking an interdisciplinary approach. Now the approach interdisciplinary here deals with complex systems or complexity theory, also with visual rhetoric in a way. And second is process, to engage those students in some kind of ethnographic study as they look at language. Now, for me, a syllabus is the first text a student reads. So I always make it sort of interactive, that it's not just a course management, but it's something that the student can study as a text. So if you look at just the design, and once again, if we're thinking about situated literacy, the situating it within where you're teaching. So if you look at the overall design of the syllabus, that first page is the Mexican flag, and the second page is the Texas flag. Okay. And then you have the American flag on the 4th page in representation in the lips, okay? Because these is the area, the context of the course. Text, let me go over text first. As I thought, I was rushed to put something like this together and say, I can do it, I know I can do it. My anchor text is going to be Peter, Sue's, and Jennifer's text on relations, locations, and positions. That is the anchor text. Why? Because out of that text, I get my comprehensive questions for the course. So I'm using that textbook to look at what are the ideological implications of transitional approaches to literacy instruction. How are we to think through the social networks that discipline how we write? What are the interconnections between discourse and geographic space? What political implications do metaphors carry, and how can metaphors enhance disciplinary knowledge or create new knowledge and understanding? How do material spaces affect the rhetorical strategies of its inhabitants? Will factors of race, sexuality, and ability shape the discursive practices of writers in our culture? And how can practitioners encounter complexities of difference more responsibly? All of that is tied also to what I just presented in Cuerpo. That is what I do. Okay, so in relations, locations, and positions, what I've done with that text is I've selected other texts that would link to that. So the first one is network process. Why? Because in that text by Helen Foster, she extends the post and post-process theory, not to break from the process movement, but an approach that sees composing as a social process. She coins network process to explore the interstitial spaces, the stasis within the post-process debate, placing the subject in relation to the cultural network where culture is understood to be comprised of complex social and political processes characterized by power relations, which sounds like what we were just talking about in our question and answers. The notion of a network subjectivity influences literacy and literacy practices, and that network subjectivity exists in relationship with discourse to others and the world. Now, network process and relations, locations, and positions is how I will then situate those texts under relations. because we're looking at the relationships with the process and post-process, and then what it means to look at writing. Then I would move to Mestiza scripts by Damien Baca, because Baca argues for new ways of thinking about writing based on material and corporeal practices that have shifted over time. He's talking about shifting of looking at Azaldua's fragmented identity, shifting from that to inventing to inventing and writing from a conceptual borderlands perspectives in order to complement Western rhetorical knowledge, okay, and to revise that knowledge. He's looking at how mestizos, the largest ethnic and linguistic minority group, can enter into world history. And he does that because he's arguing that mestizo scripts will subvert and revise the hierarchical narratives of assimilation through the symbolic mediation and border crossing. So I would include Damien Baca. Then after that is Selenidad. Why? Because I'm thinking of where I'm teaching. And this is where Selena's from. And one thing I encountered when I went to San Antonio, I was like, oh my gosh, you're Selena. I was like, yes, I know Selena, but I mean, she's big in San Antonio. So I figured it's important for students to understand how the things they're looking at rhetorically in this class apply within that cultural context they're in, whether they're Latinos or not. Even if they're not Latinos, this is a space where they occupy. And this goes back to what I learned in Death and Dying with Dr. Talley also, because looking at the memory of Selena and how that applies. So how memory, the act of remembering Selena, is inevitably imprinted by the images taken from the phenomena of Selena commemoration. And what's going on here is a really good, interesting thing, because they're looking at what happened after her death. They took that purple jumpsuit, and it didn't fit the mannequin, because the mannequins are designed for a more Western body. So it was all loose, and call it wango.
Yeah.
Okay? So they talk about that as differences in race, because they had to cut and alter that suit, or they're, so it's to evoke Selena and to evoke her absence, to attend to how that wango fit or ties to the hollowed and hallowed spaces of her remains, which goes back to the things I've learned in Death and Dying. Okay, it's an attempt to cut the garment down to size, was undeniably a racist act appealing to the standards of whiteness, and speaks to the larger practices in the U.S. culture to police and sort of attempt to refigure Latino bodies, okay? So I would use that as Selena. And those two texts would tie then to location when I'm looking at Hump's text as organizing readings. Then I'm looking at the last one, position. That goes back to the process debate. So the text that follows then would be post-composition, because that is the debate how the environment plays a role for writing. Eco-composition looked at writing from an ecological metaphor, but what happened under eco-composition is that writing was lost. So post-composition, they're actually calling it eco-composition, post-composition, is going back and looking at the writing and how the writing is affected by the environment. Okay. I'm going to keep moving forward really quick. The last text would then be translingual practices. And with that, let me see what else in my notes I have here. We're looking at the orientation, which highlights two key concepts of significance for monolingual, that paradigm shift from a monolingual. We're looking at communication transcends that individual language, and that communication transcends words and involves a diverse semiotic resources and ecological affordances. And with that, the areas I would look under that, with those two areas, is that languages are always in contact and mutually influence each other. Language complement each other. In the context of language, diversity meaning doesn't arise from a common grammatical system or norm, but things, negotiating practices in local situations. So we're going back to locations and context. And that communication involves the diverse semiotic resources, and that language and semiotic resources make meaning in the context of diverse modalities. So we can also then come back with the Selena when they're looking at images in those modalities of how she's been represented. So in a nutshell, those texts will make students have connections with what we already explored with the text under locations, that last text. It should tie everything together. And this is done under a framework of looking at linguistic differences. Okay? And continuing down that syllabus, one thing I included in my syllabus is always a mission statement. Now this is a big mission statement. But it's something I always ask is how are we fitting the mission with what the syllabus is asking us to do? And here it's working with the communities that we're under. And I have students study the text, because if we're not trying to meet that mission, then we can see how we can meet that mission. Now, the evaluation and assignments. The ethnography project would be totaling about 55%. Part of it is the portfolio, which is the gathering process. The field notes, descriptive and reflective writing. And then the position paper would be 30%. And then a presentation, 10%. In that presentation, they'd have to introduce an innovative artifact. Now, what do I mean by an innovative artifact? An innovative artifact coming out of the community that they're studying. And I would provide like an example of an innovative artifact. I don't know if any of you have seen, but do you know the Nat King Cole song, Unforgettable? Well, then he sang the song with his daughter. If you look at that video, it's a great description of looking at form and content in writing. Because his daughter is juxtaposed with Nat King Cole, there's a different meaning now in that song as a result of digital technologies. So that would be an innovative artifact. So I'd ask students to find something similar within that community they're studying. Now, I have a book review totaling 25% of the course grade. I did this because I was in a hurry. If I had more time, and I have the list of books, possible books. Now those books, I would try to find books, that connect to the course. I can't just find any books. I have a list of books there that kind of enhance the text that I have selected for the course. So there would be something about this size. If I had more time, I would develop where they don't do a book review, but they do a TED Talk over the book. And that's something refreshing where they actually have to put on their own TED Talk, just like I'm doing right now, over the content from the book as a way of introducing the knowledge. The last thing, discussion leaders, which is just, out of the reading. And I wouldn't do discussion leaders probably until the third week because I really want to establish a reading culture. And with the activities I have in the first 2 weeks, I would kind of emphasize that reading is important and that students would know because I have certain techniques to emphasize it. It's important to read. So one of the things I do is I have a reading, but instead of the student answering questions I have students, they have to come up with the questions out of the reading, or I have them illustrate the reading. I want you to give me what you know from that reading in a picture. And that's hard if they didn't read. But when I do that, they kind of get an idea that I really need to read for this class. So I would spend those first 2 weeks with those kind of activities before they take on those discussion leaders. And if you look at the syllabus, I have pictures here. The pictures aren't there just to be funny, but they're there to send a message. One of the things, I love this picture that I found a while back that talks about, missed deadlines without requesting extensions and stuff like that. And so there are all these turkeys with excuses and say, you know what, guys, I still have to eat turkey. So I need to know when you're going to have that for me. Another thing is the revision policy. I have a policy generally that if the student submitted the assignment on time, then you can revise it. And I like that because it goes with helping them develop as a writer as well. Now, do you guys have questions? I think I said everything. Oh, I have supplemental reading lists. These are readings that would enhance the readings that I have there. So like with Damien Baca, he talks a lot about Azaldúa. If a student hasn't read Azaldúa, these are two readings I would pick when it comes to Azaldúa. Lisa Flores, looking at this Chicana rhetoric as a rhetoric of difference. Language Difference in Writing by Bruce Homer, putting ethnographic writing in context as they begin that ethnography project. And then post-process pedagogy that kind of gives us a nice foundation also for that movement. And Wide Study Disability, which I just read not that long ago, that just came out, I said, yeah, that's one I have to use. So when it comes to ability. Question? Yes.
This is imagined as a graduate level course.
Yes, this is what I envision as an upper level graduate writing course.
How would you translate that then for an undergrad?
Like for like a 1302?
I don't know what course level you're sorry. Sure.
A 3? I'd probably then focus not so much on a large arc. Right now I'm focusing really like on a huge movement in composition when it comes from post-process to where we are today. I'd probably narrow it down and then I'd lower the readings on here a little bit. That's how I would lower it a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. Classic question. If I was the fly on the wall in your undergraduate class, the class you were teaching, what would I see? What would you be doing? What would your students be doing?
My classrooms are very interactive. Usually what students are doing is a little bit of individual work, a little bit of group work, a little bit of cooperative work. And some students don't like the cooperative work because the cooperative work, each of them have a stake in that final or in that one area. Sometimes that's in the form of cooperative writing. You would see me a little bit of lecture, a little bit more facilitating, and then a lot of interaction. Multiple things going on at the same time to keep movement. And occasionally I'll have like one or two students that might be, the invisible cloak. If I notice any invisible cloaks, I try to speak with them first one-on-one to see what's going on. And then I try to find ways for them to reveal a little bit of who they are as moving. Because sometimes they, I try to figure out a strategy for how we can get them to break that invisible cloak. And sometimes it's a great thing. At the end, they're like leaders, and it's okay. They lead the class.
Cool.
Yes.
The way you incorporate ethnography in the ethnography project is something that you retcon TV. Had a professor at one time we brought in to do some ethnographic work. I think that was a few years ago. Why do you see, when you've been to this institution, why do you see ethnography as important, particularly for this institution, for our students?
I think one of the great things about this institution is it's surrounded by amazing cultural things. And it's looking at that, not just coming here and being in a silo on an island, but then how can you bridge out what's outside this island? That's why I think it would be important. And exposure. A lot of times, some of my students, they're really amazed by some of the things they're exposed to when it comes to working with partners in the community, with any kind of service projects. Yeah.
I was wondering, and it sounds like you probably are really big for like peer review for a class like this. Would you have peer review in some of these assignments, all these assignments, and how would that be? Would it be like through online? Or
Well,
class?
Part of the reason I like a revision policy is that gives me a way of intersecting with that writing. A lot of us talk about writing as a process, but we don't talk about how we intersect ourselves into that process. So some of the things I do is studios. The peer reviews are successful, but they're even more successful if I'm part of that process. So I really try to have peer review sessions as studios where we look at textual artifacts and we talk about what's affecting the production of this text. Okay, because if it's something on the outside, we need to figure it out. Okay, So I'm usually a part of that process in groups.
I guess you explained it all. Yeah.